It could be said that humanity's greatest gift is our creativity. It has driven everything behind human development, from the fashioning of the first stone tool to the automobile, and the creation of starships. In those, we are driven by a dream to advance and make our existence better, but also to stretch our wings and move into space. Artistic endeavors like painting, filmmaking, and even making podcasts and YouTube videos is also driven by creativity and a desire to accomplish something. My guests today, in addition to being creatives themselves, explore creativity and the motivation behind it on their podcast, The Well, where they do regular interviews with creatives from all walks of life, from science to the entertainment industry.
Welcome to Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. Joining John this week are actor, producer and writer Anson Mount and filmmaker, producer and makeup artist Brannon Edgens. Anson has appeared in numerous productions, notably as Cullen Bohannon in AMC's Hell on Wheels and as Captain Christopher Pike in Star Trek Discovery. Brannon is an award-winning filmmaker, having received both the Golden Lion Award in Advertisement and the Tel Aviv International Film Festival Directing Award for his film Cold Comfort. Brannon is also a skilled special effects makeup artist. Together, Anson and Brannon both produce and host The Well, a podcast about creative inspiration.
Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
You guys host a podcast called The Well.
We do.
This focuses on creativity and acting and, the entertainment industry in general. But what initially motivated you guys to start telling those kinds of stories and have people on to tell their story?
Well, the focus is not the entertainment industry nor on acting in general. It's really on creative thinking and coming at that from as many different directions as possible. So we don't just have actors and musicians and celebrities. We have our very first episode is with a marine archaeologist. We have a football coach, a Pulitzer Prize-winning biologist. We try to, as I said, come to it from as many different directions as possible so they can really look at the subject of creative thinking and creativity in general in kind of a prismatic way. And I had been sort of hip-pocketing this idea for a while about doing a show where instead of asking the guests the same questions they get asked a million times by every other interviewer, maybe we should do something where we interview them not about the thing that they're known for, but about the thing that we didn't know that they do. And then that kind of morphed into the larger question of creativity in general. And Brannon's my best friend, and we have these conversations anyway, sometimes around the campfire, sometimes around the dinner table. And so it's been a great outlet for us.
So you look at creativity from different perspectives of creativity. So you say a marine biologist. How does creativity get applied in a discipline like that?
Well, that episode is specifically about trying to find a shipwreck that's linked to Moby Dick. The whale ship Essex is the inspiration for Melville's Moby Dick. But then there was another chapter of the story that had never been told, which is that Captain Pollard, who captained the whale ship Essex after they were rescued, went out and immediately grounded. He wrecked another ship.
Nice.
And that ended up, they believed, somewhere around the Hawaiian Islands. And I managed to track down and interview Kelly Gleason Keogh, who was responsible for finding that second ship, and how she went about it, and her interest in it, how her interest in American literature led to an interest in marine archaeology.
Interesting. So, the creativity was in the telling of the story that inspired, essentially, the science.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, I think that whenever you're trying to find meaning in all the chaos that's out there, that is a creative act. I mean, we're inundated with information all the time, and like a detective solving a crime, that is a creative act. You're trying to create meaning out of all of the noise and trying to filter out which parts are important. So we look at creativity as a sort of fundamentally human endeavor, something that's pretty unique to our species, especially on the level that we do it, and that creativity is something we all do. And at one point, we toyed with the idea of making the tagline for the podcast, "We are all creatives," because I think people tend to think that use that term creative as an artist, or a performer. And we were just trying to take the meaning of that word back to its root and say, no, creativity is a fundamentally human endeavor.
It is. You could, as you said, you could make the argument that it is what makes us human, as opposed to the animal kingdom. Now, what other topics have you gone into in addition to that? What really, out of the topics you've covered so far on that podcast, what has really inspired you? If both of you could answer that, what is the most inspiring thing that you've heard on your podcast?
Well, let's see. There's two ways to cut it. There's the one that inspired me the most, and then, well, I don't know what the other slice was. I'll start with, because I know we're going to get into it later. I would start with David Haskell's, the biologist, Dr. David Haskell's book, The Forest Unseen. The book itself really, really turned me on and has set me down this path. But we'll get into that later, I know. But as far as what I've learned from an interview or an interviewer or interviewee, I would say the episode on Lou Barlow, who is a musician formerly of Sebadoh and Dinosaur Jr. I've been listening to his music for 20 years, and he was so open in that interview about his regrets, and I could see a little bit of myself in him, and something he had said about taking full responsibility for your own creativity and owning it completely, and not letting other people or depending on other people sort of carry the ball for you. It really resonated with me, and I think I've been a little altered and changed by that.
Yeah, I would say Dr. David Haskell as well, and his pointing out that life is not an atomistic thing, but that it's countenanced by connection. That you don't have individual cells of life. You have to have a network in order for life to exist. And then also Coach June Jones, who took the Hawaii Warriors from being 112th in 112 teams in the NCAA to then the next year with the same roster taking a share in the Western Conference, explaining that his whole technique for coaching is love, and how you don't get love is not very highly valued in the game of football, but how he believes that love is the key, and how that fed into everything from how he conducted practice to how he related to his men, to how he picked the uniforms, and how he developed the fight song into a Hawaiian fight song. That was a real learning process for me, and I really enjoyed getting to know all these guests.
So it's sort of an interesting point. Now, this is your second creative outlet for both of you. This is a sort of secondary outlet, so that I suppose you could say that your identity isn't owned by the main part of your career. And I can say the same. This is actually my secondary creative outlet. Is that a fair thing to say, that if you're going to do a job as a creative, you're going to be restrained somewhat by the conditions and realities? So does a secondary creative outlet help you in sort of not letting things die on the creative vine, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And we actually we covered that topic specifically with Jonathan Myberg, who was one of the earlier guests in season 1. We talked about this at length, that having the ability to sort of ping back and forth from one creative endeavor to another helps you avoid that feeling of getting stuck, and also prevents you from sort of grinding yourself to a nub against one particular issue. That's one freedom it affords. And I think the other, as you said, is, by having something as loose as a podcast about creativity, it means that Anson and I completely sort of own and run on our own means that we can kind of do whatever we want. I mean, we don't have any executives yet telling us there's things that they would rather us not say or do. And that's frequently what comes into play and ruins it for a lot of creative things that you start off in love with as an amateur and then turn into a profession. And then the love gets destroyed at that intersection between art and commerce.
Yeah. For me, it's really also, I know enough about myself to know that I just need to be creating all the time. And with a career like acting, it's very, very up and very, very down. You're either working 70-hour weeks or you're not working at all. And I know that I need to have output all the time. And this is something that, I can come out of an acting job and not have to say to myself, okay, what's next? I know immediately that I've got these interviews to cut together, or I've got this guest I want to track down, or Brandon and I need to get together and record. So it's been a real, it's been a healthy dose of sanity for me on that level.
Mm-hmm. And in this day and age of podcasting and YouTube and all of these platforms where literally anyone can create, it's very easy now to be a creator and even make a living from it. But at the same time, you have no real restrictions within reason. Of course, there are. There's certain things you couldn't upload to YouTube or something like that. But you, as a creator, you have more freedom these days than ever before. Is that something that you guys have noticed since the beginnings of your career, that it's sort of opened up?
Yeah, I mean, there is a democratization of the technology, and we actually had this conversation in our interview, or actually our conversation after our interview with the action director, Raul Rene, and I pointed this out to Brannon, and he very intelligently said, yes, there's been a democratization of the technology, but that does not mean that talent is suddenly more abundant.
That's
right.
True.
I would say that there's not as much vision, and there's a lot of talent out there. I think what's difficult is that the signal to noise ratio has gotten a lot less stark, and now there's so much stuff out there, which I think is great. I love the fact that anyone can access the tools now to do almost anything. I mean, it's kind of amazing, but it's not. It hasn't revealed a larger number of visionaries, but it makes me happy that what visionaries are out there will be less likely to be stopped and stifled by a lack of access to tools. I think the example that I used was in that episode about Raul Rene was that paint used to be you had to be a chemist to make your own paint. You had to be able to, and it was a secret, where you got your minerals from and how you ground them and all of that stuff. And just because paint became commercially available didn't suddenly mean there were a lot more Rembrandts, but it did mean there was a lot more experimentation, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, I think overall it is. It's a good thing, but you're right. It doesn't seem to have, created an environment where creativity is increased. Well, I suppose it did do that, but where the actual output and quality of the output is increased, I don't think it is. But while listening to one of your episodes, you guys got into something called imposter syndrome. And this is particularly bad in the case of someone like me that, was just a science nerd that started a YouTube channel that exploded, and went big. And you're like, why did that happen? How do you guys deal with that? How did you deal with conquering imposter syndrome?
Well, for me, the biggest part of the battle was coming to the realization of what it was. And really, as soon as I put two and two together and realized that it was indeed that, it just suddenly disappeared. Because I'm pretty good about, I'll tell you a funny story. John Hamm, I ran into him at the night before party that DreamWorks throws the night before the Emmys, and I was on AMC, and I just finished the first season of Hell on Wheels, and he was John Hamm. He was the big guy at AMC, and I bumped into him after we were introduced. I bumped into him again at the men's room door, and I said, I was wondering if you had a second we could talk, and he was like, yeah, sure. About what? And he was like, oh, you mean about working for AMC? And I said, no, just about kind of the whole thing. And he goes, oh, okay. So he took me out to the smoking section. We bummed the cigarettes off of Aaron Paul. And he said, okay, so here it is. I used to go golfing with my best friend in high school, and his father was a former baseball player, and he loved to golf, and he would take us out. And one time we were out there, and I was about an 8-iron shot away from the green. And he goes and he walks up right next to the pin, and he goes, put the ball right here. And I said, psh, yeah, right. And he got really mad, and he started yelling at me. And he said, why not? Why not? Why not you? If not you, somebody else. So why not you? I said, okay. And I hit the ball, and it went exactly where he had pointed. And so ever since then, my mantra has been, why not me? And I thought that was a very useful piece of not even advice, just a way of looking at the situation. That it literally, if I had not been cast to play Captain Pike or Colin Bohannon or whatever, it was going to be somebody else. So why not me? Yeah, I don't know. You learn to accept the shoes you're given.
But that evokes another question. Self-doubt, is that related to the imposter syndrome? Do you still have, when you go into a set, and I would ask also, Brandon, you this question, when you make a film, or you go in to make a film, do you start with self-doubt? Or do you have to conquer that every time, or do you just gain confidence the more you do it?
Brandon, how would you answer that?
The thing is, for me, taking this in a whole other direction, I think, but for me, the act of creating something is therapy. So I don't have that doubt. The doubt gnaws at me more, actually, when I have, oddly enough, in moments like this, when I have to explain what I'm doing or talk about myself, that feels weird. That's where doubt arises. But when I'm going after the thing that, something that really turns me on, I kind of lose myself in it. And that's sort of the point, I think. I cease to exist, and it's just sort of the idea and the tools, and hopefully everything just sort of flows, and I get to disappear into a world and into an endeavor that I throw myself into. So I don't have the doubt goes away, and frankly, I feel more in control and more confident when I'm working than when I'm not.
Yeah,
the self-doubt is harsher when I'm sitting in bed at 2 a.m. going, why aren't I doing anything?
I'm just as nervous doing any role as I was the first role, but that's because I care. What I've gotten better at is knowing that I'll figure it out. And so I've learned to live more calmly within the chaos or within the question.
Now, just to switch gears, although I suppose it's peripherally related, in listening to your podcast, I noticed that one thing that came up is brushes with death, stories where either the guests came close to dying. So how does that factor in with creativity? I mean, is it a motivator, I suppose I would ask, is if you have something like that happen to you, does that motivate you to go and create more as quickly as you can?
No, I mean, for me, for that episode, it wasn't really about that so much as it was about taking an experience like that and realizing that had realigned, in this case, Ethan Peck, it had realigned him with a different point of view on his own life and how to move forward in that point of view. And that was, I felt very, very creative, and it was a good story.
Now, you had your own brush with death on set, right?
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
I've had a couple of brushes with death on set. Sets can be a very dangerous place. I can't talk about all of them, but the one you're sorry, what?
I just realized, that you remember that old TV video VHS series, Faces of Death? What if it was just brushes with death, and it was just people almost dying? Specifically, like the on-set chapter, of Brushes with Death. But go ahead, and we won't make you violate any non-disclosure agreements you may have already signed.
Yeah, the one you're referring to is I guess on the set of the City by the Sea, when the prison cells almost closed on a rather large portion of my torso. And I had not taken I had learned the flaw in the system, and I had not taken that to the first AD and made sure everyone else was aware. And then I ended up being in a situation where I realized nobody knew, and so we're not acting appropriately around that particular piece of equipment. But it happens, especially when you're working with elements as difficult to control as horses or pyrotechnics, and when you get in a situation where everybody's rushing to get the shot, things can happen.
I would say my most interesting brush with death was getting stalked by a mountain lion. That was a sort of a surreal experience. And on that note, we need to go to break. I am joined today by Anson Mount and Brannon Edgins. We will be back in a moment. We'll discuss Brannon's projects.
Be sure to check out The Well podcast at thewellpod.com. And now, back to John.
And we're back with Anson Mount and Brannon Edgins. Now, Brannon, you're a filmmaker.
Yes.
And you've done this for a very long time. When did your career start? What drove you into film as opposed to some other creative outlet?
That's a pretty easy one. It's sort of a two-parter. I remember being a little kid and seeing Jaws in the theater for the first time. And God, what year? I don't know. You can do the math. Whenever Jaws came out, I was born in 1973. And I went with my brothers and my dad. And at the end, my brothers and my dad started discussing, how it was done. How did they achieve this? And while they're having that discussion, I'm looking up at the screen. I'm watching all these names scroll by and the credits. And it kind of dawned on me. I'm like, oh, this is all a magic trick. This is all an illusion. And all those people up there are in the business of making it look like something happened that didn't happen. And I guess I was interested in illusion. I got interested in special effects makeup when I was in second grade. I'm not sure why, but I did. And for a long time, my interest in filmmaking was really only in the special effects makeup part of it. I hero worshipped all the makeup effects artists at the time. Remember, the 80s were the time of the sort of the golden age of splatter effects. There's a lot of gore films and stuff being made at the time. It was a golden age for that kind of art. And so I treated those movies like gallery openings. So I would read about it in Fangoria or something, and then I'd go off to the VHS rental place and rent it. And that was a gallery opening for me. And I would kind of fast forward through the films because I think deep down I knew the films actually weren't very good. But I knew that it was a place where I was going to be showcased the latest work from Rob Bottin or Mark Shostrom or Steve Johnson or someone. And I would analyze that stuff to death. Anyway, age 15, my best friend, Charlie Moss, lived up the street from me. And he would check out the more sort of foreign film section of the video store, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, I'm watching this film, and there's a shot in it where there's a guy watching his sock dry on a radiator for like a minute. I think you would like it." And I thought, okay, whatever. I walked up after dinner, and it was David Lynch's Eraserhead, and I'd never seen anything like that. And I watched all of it, and then I rewound it, and I watched it again. And I rewound it and I watched it again, and it just absolutely changed my life. It blew my mind because it was all special effects is all in the business of constructing something to create an illusion of something that didn't happen, but it's still going for verisimilitude, usually. But this was, at the time, I thought of it as effects for a different purpose, which was to construct a reality that was more like a dream state that bypassed conscious thought, bypassed conscious language, and went straight to the unconscious, where the artist had really a fantastic amount of power and control over, people's emotional responses and engagement with the thing. And suddenly I just realized, okay, it's not just. I remember walking home from that after watching that Eraserhead 3 times in a row, and it must have been 2 or 3 in the morning. And I felt like the little tool shed I had been working in that was just, special effects stuff and foam latex and plaster and clay. I felt like the walls of that workshop just fell to the side, and I was like, oh my gosh, the palette isn't just that, it's image, it's sound, it's relationship between the two, it's lighting, it's performance. And I never looked at movies the same way, and I realized you can author a dreamscape and invite other people into it with this medium.
Yeah, I believe Werner Herzog actually said it's sort of a fever dream that you're creating, and with his movie, particularly Aguirre, The Wrath of God, the whole intent was to try to evoke a fever dream. And that works for writing fiction as well. You try to create something that, you're writing fiction, so you're creating a world that doesn't exist, but you try to make it as real as possible, yet still somehow distant. And I've sort of noticed that with some of the stuff I've been watching that you've done. It's sort of surreal and very very impressive, really, because that's the stuff I like. So how many films have you made?
Oh, right now, I wish I could say that I'd made a ton of features, but I haven't. They've mostly all been shorts, and I haven't really counted them. They're short films, they're music videos. At least in the capacity of writer-director, I'm going to pull a number out of thin air and say I've made something like 7 or 8 shorts, and I don't know how many music videos, and like one or two little low-budget features that no one has seen. Yeah, that's about where I'm at right now. And then, trying to make the leap into fully budgeted is difficult, especially when you have ideas like the ones that I have.
Now, speaking of, you also make documentaries, and one of the ideas you have right now is based on The Forest Unseen by David Haskell. Tell us about that film. Lay out what you intend to do with it.
Well, The Forest Unseen is the book by Dr. David Haskell, in which he, as a biologist, looks at 1 meter of forest, in his case in Tennessee, and visits it every 2 weeks or so, and writes a chapter about what's happening on the macro level and the micro level with whatever he observes on that particular little excursion. And I think the thing that I responded to about it is that it was more than just information. David has a poet's eye, and I feel like that's missing in nature documentary. And that tends to be the kind of film I consume more than anything else. I'm a junkie for all the BBC Nature Unit stuff. I watch all of it. I bought my giant 65-inch TV just so I could watch Planet Earth. But I'm getting a little tired of the how much it relies on just awesomeness, awesome imagery, and the spectacle of it. It's a little operatic, and I love the intimacy of David's book and his intimacy with the subject. This is all a world that lives within feet and inches and millimeters, and all the way down to the atomic level. So I thought, I built this cabin up in the woods, up in the Catskills, and I own this property. And I was kind of looking for an excuse to spend more time up there since I was done building the cabin. I wanted to combine everything that I, loved and wanted to do more of, which was spend more time in the woods, make a movie, and, re-engage with my special effects and visual effects, background. So what I proposed is to repeat the experiment. It's not a exact translation from the book. I want to repeat that experiment, try to do it myself, and part of that story will be me trying to figure out basically what I'm looking at. I'm not a biologist, so there's going to be a learning curve. And it's how does one move from a place of ignorance to a place of understanding? And the way I want to illustrate it is maybe where I really part ways with most traditional nature documentaries, which is to really use whatever works. If I can illustrate something using traditional microscopy, if I can illustrate something using traditional time-lapse techniques, photographic techniques, great. If I think it'll be more engaging to recreate it as a practical effect, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm making giant puppet tardigrades, giant puppet mosquitoes, and reconstructing the life that lives under the mycorrhizal root systems as as an alien planet, because the weirdest stuff is down there at that level. And a rotifer, the first time I started really looking at a rotifer and what it looks like and its anatomy and how it moves, my first thought was, how am I going to build that?
Can't be easy. Now I saw that you're actually sculpting a tardigrade, essentially, and making a tardigrade model in many thousands of times bigger than they actually are, particularly the water bear that everybody knows. So you're focusing first on the microbial, or the small life, right?
Well, I mean, it's going to go up and down. It's depending on the structure of the book is mostly seasonal. So the winter time, there's a lot of talk about snow and ice and how things survive ice. And you have to get down to the atomic level to understand what ice is. You got to get real intimate with that. And I think that's the key word in this film project is intimacy. By watching me figure out how to represent these things on a larger scale means you've really got to understand them. I'm not just doing an animation or running it through a computer graphic. I really have to understand how these things work mechanically. So we start with ice. It also deals with the geology of the ground underneath. It deals with the life cycle of the trees, the canopy. So it really kind of, the scale of the whole thing moves up and down from very large to very tiny, and also in time scale as well, from things that take place in fractions of seconds to things that takes millennia. The Earth, the specific little spot that I'll be observing is at the end of a long story of seismic and geological events. So that has to be that also has to be covered. It's amazing how complicated it gets, how complicated 1 square meter of forest can be when you try to consider everything about it.
And you certainly are, as I noticed too, that you even cover cosmic spherules, which is the interaction between space and this section of forest. Yes,
I mean, there's I don't remember that. I can't pull the number off the top of my head right now, but the Earth gets many times heavier. Not times, it gets weight is added to the Earth every year through cosmic dust. It's so fine that we don't really see it, but it's constantly raining down upon us. I mean, just constantly, and it accumulates over time. And it's not really known what use there is for that. There may be, there may not, but it's just interesting to think of the fact that suddenly this little square meter of forest was graced with an extra little pellet of enriched of iron, which normally is not something found in that sort of concentration in the topsoil. What becomes of that? Anything? We don't know. But I love the interaction that even with your nose pressed to the ground, you are still finding evidence that we are, hurtling through space at 26,000 miles per hour.
Indeed. One thing you can never eliminate is that you are subject to the universe and its rules. Now, to get back to the well, you told a story on there about how you got into Star Trek that I found particularly touching, because it's sort of a different way than most of us got into it. Could you tell us how you got into Star Trek?
I mean, of course, Star Trek is part of the cultural landscape. You can't really not know about it. But Anson laughed at me about this because he knows me and knows that, I couldn't get into the original series because I thought the sets looked too chintzy. And I could sort of see the flats and the sheetrock and everything, at work. And I thought, I don't buy it. So I thought it was a little silly. And I didn't at that age. I just didn't connect with the ideas and the concepts there. So again, I was into special effects completely, and I was, grew up in Northwest Georgia, and didn't have a lot of access to professionals and things like that, and people that I could show my work to. So I found out that Bill Johnson who'd made a lot of dead animals for Pet Sematary 2, was going to be at Dragon Con, and I made contact with him, and he suggested we meet there, and I thought, okay, I'll just go take in my portfolio and we'll talk. I had no idea that I was getting into this, being introduced to this world of fantasy and sci-fi conventions. I didn't know anything about it. So I drove down to Atlanta to this convention center and was immediately floored by the number of people there. And I mean, I felt like I had to park half a mile away, and carried my portfolio all the way through this hot parking lot. And I kind of remember thinking, God, all these people here for a TV show, to get into their fantasy world. This is kind of sad. And yeah, I guess I was a little judgmental about it. Meanwhile, what do I have under my arm but pictures of, horror makeups and stuff? So I don't know who I thought I was to judge. And as I'm getting closer to the convention center, there's a big white van parked in the handicapped section. And as I'm passing it, I turn and I look and I see one of those elevators, letting down this kid who's probably 15 years old, and he's in a wheelchair, and he looks like he's probably a quadriplegic, and his parents are taking him down the lift off of the van, and he is dressed completely in his Starfleet uniform. And it was that human moment of suddenly, like, who am I to judge where people get their meaning from? I mean, what does Star Trek mean to that guy, and what does it mean to his parents that they made this trip from who knows where, made sure he was in his Starfleet uniform so he could attend this convention and be amongst like-minded people that he could talk to, and he could feel, someone who was probably closed off and didn't have a connection to the world like the rest of us do. That was his opportunity to connect. And I realized this is what it is for everybody. This is an opportunity for everybody to connect, and a space to connect around ideas and around inclusivity. It really moved me. There's other stories about Dragon Con that are not that go the other direction, but I'll leave it there.
One of the things that strikes me is, most of what I do is interviewing scientists, and just how many of them were originally inspired to go into science by Star Trek. Mm-hmm. And I found that to be mind-blowing, that science fiction has that power to inspire people to go and get a PhD. And yet there's countless cases of it, It's been mentioned to me many, many times. But on that note, we have to take a break. I am joined today by Brannon Edgens and Anson Mount, hosts of the Well Podcast. Check it out on iTunes, and back in a few moments.
If you'd like to support Event Horizon, you'll be pleased to know we've recently launched a Patreon. Link in the description below. Or alternatively, you can use your cellular telephone to scan the assemblage of squares on screen now. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video.
And we're back. Now, Anson, you've done a lot of acting. How long has your career stretched? When did you first decide to go into acting?
I guess I was about 16 or 17 when I decided that I wanted to study it. And then I went straight through graduate school. So I was 25 when I started professionally, and now I'm 46.
So the elephant in the room, of course, is that you were cast as Captain Christopher Pike in Star Trek Discovery. How did you get cast for that? And did you even know that you were going to get that specific role when you auditioned?
No, I had actually been speaking to them the year previous about Lorca, and they very wisely went with Jason Isaacs, who I was a fan of at that time. And then when Pike came around, they gave me a call, but they didn't tell me what it was. They asked me if I would audition for this role of Captain Parker. And I thought, oh, that sounds like a very unimaginative name for a captain, but okay. And my wife helped me put myself on tape and then sent it in, and I was cast like the next day or day after, and they called and told me what it was, and I just about fell over when I found out it was for Pike.
Now, when you take over a role that's been done by a previous actor, do you find that limiting in what you can do with the character as an actor?
Well, I don't think I'd ever really done that before outside of theater. I mean, in theater. So I guess the answer is no, because in theater, you're not going to be the first person who's ever played Hamlet, but you're looking for your Hamlet. And not to say that this, Pike was like tackling Hamlet, but Pike afforded even more freedom because we know his first act, which we don't really have a lot of material on, and then we know his third act, but the second act is left wide open. So I've actually felt more freedom than anything to come in and help define and fill out the character.
Now, how did you do that? What did you add to the character?
I really just took the cues from the writers. I didn't have, when you do TV, especially when you're coming into a show that you're not really a part of, you're a guest on, you learn to be a little careful about the footprints you're laying down because you're gonna have to sit with them, or the show is gonna have to sit with them for a very long time. So I did my research, as I always do, and then I tried to stay in conversation with the writers about what it is that they were wanting to do and what they felt the character needed to service in the show.
Now, were you surprised at the scale of this show going into it?
Well, I knew it was going to be a big production, but I had no idea how big. It's definitely the biggest thing that I've ever participated in. By the end, we were taking up like 7 sound stages at Pinewood Studios in Toronto. I didn't really feel like I could find my way around until about the end of the 3rd episode. It was a lot of set.
Now, let's take the bridge set. The moment you had to sit in the captain's chair for the first time, what did you feel?
Well, have to sit. I was really looking forward to sitting in the captain's chair, and thank goodness I got to do it on a day I wasn't actually working. I was just in for a costume and makeup test, and the art director was showing me around, and there was just a few carpenters around, and there was plastic on all the set pieces, and she pulled the plastic off the captain's chair and said, "You want to give it a try?" And I was honestly surprised at my reaction. It was a little emotional because suddenly I was hit with this full circle experience of having, grown up playing Star Trek as my make-believe game, and then here I was still playing make-believe as a career and getting to do this again in a way that I'd always dreamed. It was just, it was amazing.
Now, when did you first get into Star Trek?
It started, the original series started in syndication on my local UHF channel when I was about 8, I think. And it was my mom that told me, she said, "Oh, you have to watch this show," because she had seen it when it originally aired. And I said, "Why?" And she explained what it was about. These people fly around in this spaceship and they go visit all these planets. And it sounded like a terrible idea to me. But I gave it a shot and I was quickly hooked. And every Sunday night at 6 o'clock, I was watching Star Trek. And I've probably watched every episode of the original at least 3 times.
When you say that your mother introduced you to Star Trek, did that create a bond between you two?
Oh, we already had a very, very secure bond. And my mom and I, we loved, our favorite thing to do was she let me skip school every now and then. We'd go into Nashville and we'd go to the movieplex and we'd just watch one movie after another.
Now, one thing you said in one of the podcasts, you said that you effectively, quote unquote, stole the way Shatner sits in his chair from the original series. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I'd seen Chris Pine do it so well at the end of the first J.J. Abrams movie. And I just thought, why not? Let me see if I can do it better. Even though I was playing Pike, I was like, I don't care. I'm gonna see if I can nab that moment as well. I'm still not sure I did it as well as Pine, but I was working with a handicap.
Even still, though, it conveys confidence, I think. When you see that on screen, it's like, that's the captain.
Mm.
Now, influences. Now, that's an influence. So, as an actor, and as myself as an author, authors rob people blind, as we say, because we're always just pulling bits and pieces from other books and ideas and adapting and everything. Is it similar for an actor?
Yeah, well, it depends on which actor you're talking about. You happen to be speaking to a very good thief and a big believer in stealing, not entire performances, but little pieces of inspiration here and there, but you got to be a good thief, and therefore you got to watch good actors. I steal from Denzel. I steal from Jack Nicholson. I've stolen from the cruise missile himself. I do that in a number of ways. I do steal wholesale, but then also when I was still struggling and I had a big audition the next day, one thing that always helped me, and I cannot explain to you why, but I always made sure to watch a movie in which I knew there was going to be great acting the night before I had to do this big audition. And there was nothing in specifically I was stealing, but it somehow put me in the mindset of, I don't know. And maybe it was just a tradition. Maybe it was just a mind trick I was doing with myself, but it seemed to help.
Yeah, it's sort of one of those things where you see something on screen, being performed by an actor that just sticks in your mind, and you can't forget it. For example, for me, it's like Klaus Kinski, the German actor. He would just do things that are just crazy amazing on screen, and they just stick in your mind. Now, one thing about your time with Star Trek Discovery, there is a petition online that fans want to see a spinoff. How's that make you feel, and would you do it?
Yeah, I saw that. It's tremendously flattering. I don't think I've ever received such a response from anything I've ever done. And it's crazy when these things start to have a life independent of yourself. The easy answer is I love the show. I love the franchise. I love the character. I love the people that I worked with. So it's kind of a no-brainer. Of course I would, but obviously I think that before any of that were to happen, that would involve several people at a much higher pay grade than myself having some creative conversations and figuring out what, if anything, they would want to do with it.
How does it make you feel to have portrayed a character that's been with Star Trek since literally the very beginning and having done it well? How does that make you feel when you go to a convention and see all those faces,
Well, first of all, thank you. It's surreal. It is. I feel fortunate every single day, and I do love going to these conventions. And I'm not gritting my teeth when I say that. I really, let's be honest. It's a line of people walking up and patting you on the back. It's like, but I do think that actors are sometimes given too much of the credit. It's a fantastic team of writers who were just as responsible for breathing life into Pike again. And I just kind of show up on time with my lines down, and I try to tell the truth.
Now, you work with Brannon and I was curious, how did you guys meet?
We met in the men's bathroom of Gary Hall on the campus of Sewanee, the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, when I was 18, and I was at a cast party for the Trojan Women, and I wandered into this men's room to do my business, and from the stall next to me, I heard somebody start singing the bass riff from Danzig's I Am the One.
Nice.
Which is one of my favorite songs at the time. And I started singing the lyrics. I was born in the dark, but never had no home. And then suddenly we're both flush, and we end up in the sort of lobby area of this bathroom doing the entire song, and we've been friends ever since.
I absolutely love that Glenn Danzig got mentioned on this show at least once, because I like that. I like that song too. Now, what's on tap other than The Well and continuing that? What's next for you?
Primarily house moving.
House moving.
Yeah, my wife and I got a house in Connecticut, so we're in the middle of that move, and just finished shooting a movie with Anthony Hopkins called The Virtuoso, and that is literally just finished shooting that. So absolutely no idea when that's going to be out, but that was a delight. He's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man. And And then there are a couple of other things I can't talk about right now, but staying busy.
Now, you mentioned on the well that you're going to have Anthony Hopkins on. When is that going to be?
Well, I have the interview in the can. We talked for like 2 hours, and then I realized that I was late for a meeting, and almost I had to run out of there right just when we started to talk about his music. He's a composer, and so I still owe more on that conversation. So I'm hopefully gonna get back to LA and do that before we publish.
So both of you, what's next for the well in general? Is there any other guests or anything like that you have upcoming that's exciting you?
Well, I can say that we have a lot in the can, and we've been publishing at a pretty fast pace. We're putting up about a show a week, that's a lot for us. And so we're going to keep doing that for a little while, but we may be slowing down that pace a little bit. It's getting to the point where we're either going to have to sacrifice the quality or the amount that we publish. And I think that we'd rather hang on to the quality and be able to do some other things. But we also have some ideas we've been kicking around for an upcoming season that's going to be a sort of a different structure that we can't really talk about right now, but it's very exciting.
And on that note, we are out of time. Thanks for appearing with us, both of you.
Our pleasure. Great questions.
Thank you so much.
Very creative questions.
Well, I am an author, just not a very good one. Creativity is an inherently human thing, whether it's making a craft or a podcast, or even just coming up with new twists on old recipes. I think we are all creatives, and at no time in human history has it been so easy to show others, with the advent of places like YouTube or podcasting or even Facebook, that creativity is available to everyone, and we are all capable of it. Creativity is more or less a common theme among humanity. So how are you creative? What's your creative outlet? Tell us in the comments below.
John, why are you always asking the guests questions about tardigrades?
What? This was the first time, and I like tardigrades.
You took the first opportunity you had, and you've made videos on them. Endless videos.
They're the most resilient animal on Earth. They can survive exposure to space. How are you not interested in them?
Why would I be interested in what's essentially biological nanites, John?
They're kind of an alternative to nanotechnology if you think about it. Why? Are you interested in conventional nanotechnology?
Oh no, of course not, John. Not in your lifetime.
On that note, next week I'll be joined by Dr. Brian Keating to talk about the early universe and losing the Nobel Prize. See you then.